Welcome to our second reading from the Governance Public Debt Nexus, a case study of Jamaica with Barbados and Singapore as comparators. Chapter 1, 1.4 to 1.8.
Government's role in macroeconomic management. Macroeconomics is concerned with economy-wide aggregates relating to savings, investment, money supply, interest rates, consumption, and government expenditure, employment, and inflation. Mulder 1991. Todaro 1997. Government's key macroeconomic responsibility is to craft fiscal and monetary policies and to determine how and by whom these policies are to be implemented. Monetary policy is geared at regulating money supply, exchange rates, inflation, and interest rates, while fiscal policy deals with the management of public finances through national income and expenditure. Though interest on debt is managed through fiscal policy, public debt is affected by both fiscal and monetary policy. Through the impact of inflation and interest rates on the cost and maturity profile of the public debt. The higher the level of debt accumulated, the greater the pressure on the government to reduce expenditure and slash or increase revenues to meet debt service obligations. These reductions had negative impacts on economic growth and development over the period of the study, page 19. Effective public debt management is therefore a central part of government's broad macroeconomic responsibility. This has gained increasing prominence in the development literature since the 1980. While the initial global focus at the time was on external debt, not much attention was paid to domestic debt. Consequently, Jamaica's domestic debt to GDP increased from 36% in 1989 to 77% by 2003, without much international attention. The 1990 financial crises led to a greater focus on the total debt portfolio and the governance institutions through which debt management strategies were implemented. Capagoda 2002-1. Today, the debates about the role of governance institutions in macroeconomic management are as active in developing as in advanced economies of North America and Europe, particularly since global recession, which started in 2007. This has led to intense deliberations in the US Congress, the European Union, the British and other parliaments, among economists and in global financial markets, about government's role in managing the economy and the need to curtail debt accumulation. Many have also questioned whether or not the government should have been involved in quantitative easing QE, which is the repurchase of government securities to stimulate economic activity. BIS 2011 Vinyls 2012. While some saw QE as a less than ideal Keynesian approach to drive growth, higher than average levels of growth have been achieved by countries like China and Singapore, with significant government involvement and oversight. Lee 2000, Chang 2002, Kaufman 2003, and Toy 2006. 1.5 Channels through which governance impacts public debt. The government of some territories have sought to achieve development and growth by focusing on creating a favorable, enabling environment for the private sector, while other governments have taken on a more overt role by investing directly. The latter strategy depends particularly heavily on having effective controls, the competence and integrity of government, and the quality of its institutions, as there will always be the temptation to direct public funds towards political allies and supporters. It is therefore important to examine the channels through which governance impacts indebtedness to determine the channels that may or may not be functioning effectively, and whether there are features within them that may be altered to curtail indebtedness. Figure 1.2 below outlines the manner in which each channel functions to impact public debt: institutional, fiscal policy, ethical and moral, public debt, developmental, political/electoral, social, legislative/constitutional. Figure 1.2 Channels through which governance impacts public debt. Copyright CJAS. 1. Institutional. This relates to the capacity and autonomy of agents of government, as well as the rules and regulation governing acquisition, accumulation, and repayment of public debt. 2. Fiscal policy. The impact of this channel depends on the competence of the team with responsibility for crafting the budget, devising revenue strategies, and meeting fiscal obligations. Accuracy and timeliness are crucial to ensure that the actions taken are aligned with an effective debt management strategy. 3. Monetary policy. As with fiscal policy, this channel can affect public debt accumulation positively reduction or negatively increase through the management of interest, exchange and inflation rates. Inefficiency, repeated devaluations, and lack of coordination can lead to unsustainable levels of debt. Ethical and moral corruption, immoral conduct by public officials, and the circumvention of institutional controls can lead to rapid debt accumulation. Developmental lack of strategic planning and substandard human, infrastructural, and technological development can lead to an exponential increase in public debt. Political/electoral national leaders making governance decisions, including those relating to acquisition and use of public debt, are chosen by the ballot. Poor candidate selection can result in nepotism, profligacy, corruption, and wastage, resulting in further debt accumulation. Legislative/constitutional legislation must be effective and consistently enforced in tandem with constitutional provisions to ensure that there are robust constraints to deter profligacy and wanton debt accumulation. Social effective developmental policies and programs can expand technical and human capacity to reduce indebtedness and welfare dependency. This in turn lessens the likelihood of public debt accumulation for welfare programs. The government's social service philosophy can influence how these programs are financed and the level of debt accumulated. Government's involvement in the economy. There are different schools of thought regarding the extent to which government should be involved in the economy. Yet there is a consensus amongst leaders and economists of varying ideological persuasions that there has to be some level of governmental involvement. Smith 1776, for example, argued that government's main role was to provide security, property rights protection, and an enabling environment to drive productivity and growth, with the market determining levels of supply and demand. Keynes, on the other hand, took a more interventionist stance, focusing on government's role in the monetary system to reduce unemployment and increase demand. Page 21. Page 22. Through short-term stimulus spending 1936. Though their perspectives differed, both Smith and Keynes were unsupportive of profligate government spending and debt accumulation. In fact, Keynes firmly advocated for the prudent management of national reserves, as he felt that an imprudent government can make unreasonable demands on the Treasury. He also argued that an Act of Parliament is a very ineffective method of curtailing the powers of a government. And in almost every known case of stress or strain in which the note regulations interfere with the wishes of the government of the day, it is the former which has given way. 1971-235. While Smith 1776 argued for government to take a laissez-faire approach, Keynes 1971 believed government should play a more activist role. Government activism is more pronounced in economies like China, South Korea, Singapore, and Cuba than in most Western economies. The extent of government's involvement has often been examined in empirical studies through levels of democracy, frequency of elections, ratio of trade with other countries, and government expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product, GDP. C. Williams and Sadiq 2005. Though the literature often highlighted openness and democracy as features which contribute to good governance and development, relatively closed economies like Cuba have still been able to achieve high standards of development, particularly in education and health care. This apparent anomaly has led to empirical works like that of Siroe and Inkeels 1990, who evaluated several studies looking at the impact of democracy and development on growth from neutral, pro and counter positions. After extensive analysis, they concluded that political procedures and institutions were the key factors required to support democracy and spur growth. Piarzuewski and Limungi 1993 conducted a similar analysis of 21 empirical studies. 8 found in favor of democracy, 8 against, and 5 found no difference. They concluded that political institutions do matter for growth, but thinking in terms of regimes does not seem to capture relevant differences. P. 51. It is clear, therefore, that economic performance is affected by the quality of institutions. A country like Singapore, for example, with leaders perceived as benevolent dictators, has still consistently recorded growth and development comparable to highly democratic ones. Singapore scored between 98 and 100 on the WGI Institutional Measure of Regulatory Quality every year since the indicators were introduced in 1996. The works of Coast 1992 North 1990, 1991 Asemoglu et al. 2003 and others have led to a greater focus on underlying institutional factors such as rules, regulations, and the quality of decision-making that influence economic performance. Consequently, the state versus market approach to government involvement has led to new debates within the political, economic, and academic spheres about how these institutions ought to be structured and managed to enhance development and growth. Since the 1990 many once closed economies have opened up to market-driven policies and heavy external borrowing. Some have done so voluntarily, and others out of an obligation to meet stipulations of multilateral institutions. Particular challenges are presented when highly indebted, low-growth countries aim to achieve sustained growth and development without effective institutions, governance institutions, and empirical review. There is now an expanding body of literature suggesting that weak institutions result in poor macroeconomic performance, unsustainable debt, and fiscal challenges. Kaufman Cry and Zoida Lobothan 2000, Khan 2007, Giles 2011, Amini and Katsati 2010 also noted that a weak governance and institutional infrastructure could have a direct negative effect on growth by lowering the productivity of the economy as institutions affect the quality of fiscal management. This view was also shared by Edwards and Tabellini 1991 and North 1991, who argued that political and economic institutions are both essential. However, Sachs and Warner 1995 countered these arguments in their study using data from the Bureaucratic Efficiency Index, arguing that an abundance of natural resources could be inimical to economic growth, even if institutions were considered. Sill, Asemoglu et al. 2003 used settler mortality as an instrument of governance institutions for several former British colonies to examine whether there were correlations between bad macroeconomic policies and economic volatility, or if there were institutional factors at play. They found that weak institutions were characteristic of countries with poor macroeconomic policies, including unrestrained powers given to politicians and elites, lack of respect for property rights, unbridled corruption, and political instability. p. 49. They concluded that such countries were more prone to experiencing economic instability. This body of work highlights the nexus between governance institutions and macroeconomic performance. Similar conclusions were drawn from empirical studies conducted by Easterly and Levine 2003 and Roderick et al. 2004. Nevertheless, these arguments were refuted by Henry and Miller 2008, who examined the divergence between real per capita incomes for Jamaica and Barbados from 1960 to 2000, and concluded that the macroeconomic policies chosen, and not institutions per se, accounted for differences in economic performance. p. 1. However, when their work was juxtaposed against that of Asemoglu et al., the concluding arguments were found to be related as policies are formulated and implemented within and through institutions of governance. Sachs 2003 also sought to refute Asemoglu et al.'s arguments using a malaria index and governance indicators to argue that when regressed against per capita income, the evidence showed that development depended on a confluence of geographical, institutional, and political factors. p. 9. Notwithstanding these arguments, the works produced by Asemoglu et al. 2001 have been some of the most popularly referenced in the governance and institutions literature. Williams and Siddiq 2005, 151. This focus on governance institutions has continued as economists, theorists, and academics have sought to examine the impact of institutions on macroeconomic performance. An institutional feature that was repeatedly found in the literature was constitutional protection of property rights. This was also a key element in the Washington Consensus and relates to the important corresponding adherence to the rule of law characteristic identified by the United Nations as a central feature of good governance. There was also a great emphasis in the literature and guidelines published by international financial institutions and bilateral lenders, and the need for institutional reforms in borrowing countries to improve efficiency, transparency, and accountability in debt management IMF/WB 2002 WB/IDB 2006 EC 2007. This is consistent with North's seminal works 1990, 1991, which highlighted that transaction costs from ineffective institutions can undermine economic performance through weak governance.
Join us again tomorrow for another reading.